An interesting thing that I learned recently about what happens in the brain when we experience grief is that essentially when we experience loss, our brain goes through its own grieving process. So let's imagine that your brain is a computer and somewhere there's someone behind a curtain who's programming that computer. Now let's imagine that as we go through our lives, that programmer is essentially creating a map of our lives. And what that map might look like is that the things that are important to us, people that are important to us in our lives, things that we like doing essentially are in the map more readily available to us so that we know they're there, we can sense them being there, and all of this kind of is like a layout of our programming and essentially a mental map that we can access when we need to. Think about it like if you wake up in the middle of the night and it's dark. You kind of generally have a mental sense of where things are located in your room or in your house. So if you wake up in the middle of the night, you're less likely to, say, stub your toe on your nightstand or your dresser because mentally you have a sense of where those things are located in your room because you've spent so much time there. Like if I close my eyes, I could picture where my bed is, where my nightstand is. I have a little bench next to the bed, so I would be able to avoid that, etc., etc. Textures of the rugs that I might touch. All of these things are mentally mapped out, so we can literally picture them and kind of have a sense of where they would be at. So what happens if something in our lives changes so suddenly, so drastically, that now our reality doesn't fit the map that programmer has spent all that time creating for us? In the book, The Grieving Brain, she talks about how grief, the feelings, the difficulty, the confusion, the sometimes like longing for these things that used to be in our lives that are no longer present in our lives. She refers a lot to people that we lose, but this can also apply to chronic illness. Anything related to the losses that we've experienced with chronic illness, that it's essentially the feelings are reflected in a mismatch between our mental map of our lives and what our new reality is, and how it's so much different that our brain can't keep up with it. It's still trying to operate off the old map that programmer created. And also grieving, the process that we go through when essentially our brain is trying to recreate that map that we're also going through emotionally, trying to figure out how to adapt to these changes. And then if, with chronic illness, you experience so many diverse changes all at once, it gets hard. That programmer can't keep up trying to recreate a whole new map of our lives. And so this brings up a lot of confusion, frustration, big feelings, right? And that this is essentially the process that the brain goes through, where it's still trying to operate off the old map, but then at a certain point realizes that's not going to work and literally has to recreate a new map of our lives. The other thing I was really thinking about as I read this book, because I read all these types of materials and then try to conceptualize how that might apply to chronic illness. Now, that doesn't mean that this is true. These are ideas, and this is how my brain works as a person living with chronic illness. But one of the things I was curious about is this research based off of normative, healthy subjects, right? So like what happens if you have a chronic illness, for example, where it's neurological in nature? If your brain is having difficulty processing information, if you're experiencing difficulty with cognition as a symptom of it, a dysfunction in your executive function in your brain, brain fog, as we might call it. what happens if we're trying to grieve and our brain really can't keep up with that mental task because of our chronic illness? Would that mean that this process becomes delayed, or that our brain struggles to recreate that map in a way that's different from, say, a healthy individual? I think these things are good to remember when you're feeling feelings of grief, because what it tells us is A, the stages of grief, while helpful for conceptualizing grief, don't fully encapsulate the complexity involved in what we go through when we're feeling grief and the process of grieving that we go through. Also, I think this is why it's so important to give yourself adequate time and space and just so much patience to really process feelings of grief, and also to support your body in whatever way you can with chronic illness so that it can do this at whatever pace it needs to.